All right, we're gonna get rolling again with our block number 5 sessions. So what I love about these longer breaks when I observe people, it's like people aren't really sure what to do. It's kind of like a Minnesota goodbye in a way. It's like, oh, the break time's coming to an end. I need to start talking to these other people, which is awesome. But if you feel like the breaks at first, you're kind of like, oh, I'm not sure if I should go talk to somebody or whatever. Just right away in the breaks, take advantage of those and go connect with people. Or if you're like me and sometimes need to get a little bit of time alone, go outside for a walk, whatever you want to do during the breaks. They are on the longer side, but that's intentional so that there's a little bit of decompression time from the other shared learning that's going on. So we're going to get rolling with block number 5. Our first presentation is from Angie Gupta, who's with the University of Minnesota Extension. She's a forester. Here we go, Angie.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to talk to you today about terrestrial invasive species, crowdsourcing to citizen science. And we're going to use this right now. All right, perfect. So I've divided these kind of in 3 different ways of thinking about them. And so you have sort of these easy ones, crowdsourced. They can be done using a free app on a smartphone. And then these take a bit of a keener eye. They're a little bit trickier, but they're not super hard. And then these take repeat visits, multiple actions. And I'm only going to talk about the 5 that have arrows next to them. So if you want any more information on all of these projects, it can be found at that Z link. It will often be at the bottom right corner of my slide if you miss it now. All the outreach was done through existing extension social media channels. And so there were no designated press releases or extra trainings. There has been no designated funding outside of my salary covered by extension. And then in the enhanced abstract, the printed version, there's a chart which has some key highlights. And the online version, I added the demographic data. All right, so the very first one is just sort of a quick go through. This was the first project we launched in 2020. Each of these projects has about a 5-page planning document, which includes this kind of long run-on sentence called a unique value proposition, but it includes like all the basics. So I'm just going to read it. A find and report squirrel project for extension natural resource volunteers during the City Nature Challenge that engages citizen scientists to report the distribution and density of squirrel to help us better understand its impact. And if you're not familiar with squirrel, it's a spring ephemeral. It's non-native, and it really wasn't on the radar of many folks that I knew about. So we ran this project, and this is what we found. So the map on the left is EdMaps before the project. The map on the right is EdMaps after the project. 48 new finds in Minnesota, 2 in Wisconsin, and the northernmost report of squirrel in the United States in Thief River Falls. So that really helped us understand its distribution and density a little bit better. This is decidedly more complicated project. This is gender bending trees. And so this one has that hand lens because it does take repeat action and it's just a harder lift. So this long run-on sentence, unique value proposition, a gender bending trees RPR22 project for the University of Minnesota Extension natural resource audiences that engages participants to identify, report, track, and record tree gender, enables professionals to better understand what gender of RPR tree are being planted, and if they're really switching genders, unlike the existence evidence void surrounding the possibility of mislabeling trees at point of sale versus trees actually switching gender. And so if you're not familiar with RPR tree, it's being planted in some municipalities to replace ash, and it has shown invasive qualities in other states. And so, and then it appeared that it might be changing. So if you planted a male cultivar, it might be producing fruit, which was not the desired outcome. So trying to better understand this. So only 11 volunteers actually finished this project with me. So not a very big group, but they monitored 77 trees in an area roughly bounded by Rochester, Mankato, and the Twin Cities. Critical findings, 12 trees with fruit, 67% had male flowers or were considered at time of purchase to be generally seedless, yet they produce seed. And then 16 trees with male flowers, or 37.5% of them produced fruit. So this is kind of a big deal. And what that looks like is this. On the far left is one of our volunteer pictures, and that's of a female flower. The one on the left next to that is a male flower. And then those were taken in June. It turns out we didn't even exactly know when they flowered, but it's about a 2-week period in early June. And then I had volunteers go back out, go to those exact same trees using the EdMaps Pro app and look for fruit. And this is what they found in the fall after leaf off in November. And then you can see on the far right, the fruit stem. And so this is what we were able to use for data. And so I'm delighted to report that in January of this year, the Minnesota Noxious Weed Advisory Council recommended to the Minnesota Department of Ag Commissioner, who will make the final decision, to put Amur cork tree on as a specially regulated plant on the Minnesota Noxious Weed list. And if they do that, the recommendation is to only sale of male cultivars would be prohibited, and then all sales of all other Amur cork tree are prohibited. And then all existing planted and escaped fruit producing trees must be controlled by tree removal or other means such that the seed is not disseminated. And so the idea here from a forestry perspective is an ounce of prevention is worth way more than a pound of cure, right? So if we prevent the next invasive plant from establishing in our ecosystems, we've really saved a lot of time and energy. So I'm super excited that within 2 years, a project that we didn't know that we could do might actually result in a change in state statute. So fingers crossed. So I alluded to this last night, jumping worms. I'm not going to go into jumping worms themselves, but if you're unfamiliar with them, they're a new invasive worm that is causing all kinds of havoc in our forests and in our gardens. And there are no scientific recommendations for how to manage worms, period, and that includes jumping worms. And so in 2020, I launched this project, Jumping Worms Report Management, really looking at homeowners or any kind of owners that had jumping worms. So if you didn't have jumping worms, you cannot participate in my project. And the first year, it was essentially the second part of this unique value proposition. And in the second year, 2021, I added the first part. So the unique value proposition, a 2021 Jumping Worms Report Management project will serve a dual purpose. One, provide emotional support to landowners impacted by jumping worms. So that was new. And two, gather data from landowners on jumping worm management activities in order to inform future scientific research and empower others impacted by jumping worms. So that was kind of the original goal. And so in 2020, we had some, this is the first year we did it, lots of creative gardeners doing lots of creative things. And so this picture on the right is an example of solarization. So the idea that you can essentially cook using the sun, the soil enough to kill worms and eggs and cocoons. But they tried lots of different things and they told me how it went. Lots of observation of environmental impacts. We have very little data on what plants are most impacted by jumping worms, which ones aren't. If they're native or non-native, we just don't know very much. And then I was able to incorporate some of that information and learning into some of Lee Freilich's work at the University of Minnesota. And some of it we just continue to learn through repetitive action in this project. And then it became really clear in 2020 that I needed to add some emotional supports, because what I was experiencing was people were calling me on the phone and crying about their jumping worms. And I'm happy to be empathetic and to be a great ear, but the answer is, I'm sorry, I have no recommendations for you, is a deeply dissatisfying answer. And so I was able to connect with our Minnesota Master Naturalist online trainees. It was the first year they did online training and they needed activities that people could do. And I pitched this and one other, you'll hear about it in a moment. And Glory, if they didn't get picked up, I was a little shocked. So those volunteers did a lit review for me on the emotional impacts of jumping worms. There's no literature about that. So they had to expand it to the emotional impacts of climate change, for which there is literature. And so in 2021, I added a section based on that lit review about, I'm not actually going to go into details about these. You're welcome to talk to me at lunch or a break, but solastalgia, serious leisure, and disenfranchised grief. These, I think, are the experiences of the participants. These are the words that we can put to their emotions. And then some potential ways in which they can manage them include rituals, hope and agency, and nature-based human health benefits, remembering these things. And I will say, I was beginning to think that my project alone, just participating in the project, was enabling hope and agency. And it turns out I was right. Now, I don't have any outcomes yet for 2020. I got an email yesterday that the data is all summarized and I need to review it. So that's super great, but it is not yet done. So it will be at that website at the bottom right if you guys want to check it out in a month. So I did do a survey of my participants. And in that survey, I used a survey, I kind of recreated it from a climate change survey for, it was called Sustaining the Conservationists. So really looking at professionals like us and how we're dealing with the emotional impacts of climate change. I tweaked it to apply to my research or my audience. And this is what I learned. So jumping worms cause a lot of sadness, fear, panic, impatience, and anger, and increase negative thoughts and produce tears. By participating in this project, feelings become more positive, reduce worry, increase confidence, increase attention to environmental change, and increase jumping worm outreach efforts. So just by participating in the project, even if we don't have a solution. So that makes me feel better. I want to show you this picture on the right of these women. That is not an accident. My survey respondents were median age 57.5, 92% white, and 88% women. Some other findings, even when jumping worm management costs money and takes time, respondents reported a sharp increase in jumping worm management. So people are not throwing in the towel and walking away. They're actually deeply engaged, and they're working, and they're willing to put time and energy and money into that. And then I think this is really important, this bottom one in bold. As communicators, we must manage the stories and actions we tell, because those also cause anxiety, mourning, anger, hopelessness, and motivation. So there were questions about having them think back to stories or actions they'd seen others do related to jumping worms, and these are the emotions that they felt. So I feel like you guys might be data people. And so this is some of the data. The far right-hand column is the combinations of columns, moderate well to extremely well. It's a summary. And you can see the left, the 5 bolded ones were over 50% in that combined column. So as you can see, anxiety, 76% for reported anxiety, mourning, anger, hopelessness, and motivational changes. So interesting. They're like, now there's data. This crying thing was real. So 57% said they had negative thoughts about jumping worms. 19% reported crying either publicly or privately related to jumping worms. And 19% had a heightened sensitivity to jumping worms. So again, I think it's important that we realize that there are people behind all of these decisions, and we need to be able to understand what they're feeling in order to help them work through these issues and be better stewards of the land. So switching gears, a different project. So this is find and report. So it's a bit akin to the squirrel hunt, but a bunch of species. So the Find and Report 2021 project will engage Minnesotans interested in nature and invasive species, will enable volunteers to find and report targeted species of concern, filling existing gaps in distribution and density information, and informing Minnesota noxious weed policy. I just got smarter about it. Like, that's what I'm hoping to do here. And so the species of concern: black alder, Siberian pea shrub, Japanese tree lilac, and porcelain berry. And these are all, if you're not familiar with these are all plants in horticulture that have signs of invasiveness from somewhere else, or we sort of know that they are invasive. They just haven't been well distributed in Minnesota. And so this is kind of a weird graph. So this is 11 years of data, so way predates my work, but I'm trying to figure out what might be good candidates for work like this. And so the yellow line is Siberian tree shrub. And to be clear, that is not a gigantic increase in the Siberian tree shrub in the environment. That is a gigantic DNR data dump of Siberian tree shrub information into the data set. Then this is the first time we ever taught in forest pest first detector, European black alder. And so I think it's a good reminder that once you teach people something, they don't just run out and forget it. They kind of tuck it away. And then when it feels like it might be pertinent, they kind of dust off those brain cells and they think about it again. And then this is me at one site, Plummer House in Rochester. So that's a Japanese tree lilac report. So this next slide, I'm going to get rid of this a little bit. I'm going to zoom in. And so you can still see that Siberian tree shrub report coming down from the DNR. I've taken out my reports, over 100 reports of Japanese tree lilac in Rochester. And then you can see again, you have this first report of forest pest first detector Japanese, when we first taught it, European black alder. And then you have what I've circled is my project starting in 2021. And I think what this is telling us is species that are really new to the landscape are probably best for citizen science. So these that may have been around longer, like Siberian tree shrub, the professionals might have a better handle on that. All right. So last one, mysterious mulberry. So this project, this mysterious mulberry project, will identify the current distribution of native red mulberry and non-native white mulberry by asking observant Minnesotans interested in nature, including master naturalists and master woodland owners, to find, identify, and report these trees in iNaturalist to help scientists understand where these species are, as well as inform future scientific research about the perceived decline of red mulberry and invasiveness of white mulberry. And this is one of those, it takes a keener eye project, not because what I'm asking them to do is all that hard. iNat's really easy, but identifying mulberries is really hard. And so that was the keener eye business. And so again, I asked Minnesota Master Naturalists to help me. I needed to find some good resources and just generally do some research on mulberry because the data is a little bit sparse here in Minnesota. And indeed, they picked that up and they helped me. And so here on the left top is a white mulberry before, white mulberry after, and these are non-native, red mulberry before, red mulberry after, all in the data set iNaturalist. So you can see 181 new mulberry reports in iNaturalist. That is over 100% increase in reports from all previous reports in 1 year. One verified red mulberry, that is Welby Smith at the DNR that does verification. That is a total 20% increase in the known red mulberry in the state. So there are only 6 trees that we can reasonably assume are alive. And then 148 confirmed white mulberries. That's 164% increase in known white mulberry distribution. And so if you put all that information together, for every 1 red mulberry in the state, there are likely 52 white or hybrid mulberries. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. So I took this apart by data set. So I went to the Bell Museum's data set to look at historical records. And then I took out the trees that are dead, like that shouldn't be alive because of their expected life expectancy. And that's what you have left. So you have 5 red mulberries in that original data set, 14 hybrids, we'll talk about that in a minute, and 54 whites. Now, if you look at this is in iNaturalist. It turns out we don't have a way to scientifically prove if white mulberries can hybridize. There's no test for that. So there's no category in iNaturalist about hybridization. So I can't pick it. It's not a thing. And it's interesting that there were 14 hybrids in the original data set when we can't actually confirm hybridization. So, but you can see there's a really sharp increase in non-native white mulberries and no comparative increase in that. And then these 6 are my best guess at hybrids. All right, so what does that mean? For every 1 native red mulberry in the state, there are 52 non-native or hybrid mulberries. So that's a mess, right? If you think about trying to maintain that species. I am delighted to say that a group of national researchers and propagators are starting to work on several large proposals to see if red mulberry can be commercially introduced and grown. So I'm really excited about that. That is a direct result of this project. Almost done, I promise. So looking at all these projects together, there's some interesting data information. So red is women, blue is men. The yellow is unsure based on first names in their profiles. This is the most interesting part. There is a gigantic difference in gender when you look at how hard the project is. So the harder it is, the way more women are doing the work. So that's what I got there. So my closing slide is that I think there's a ton of potential for engaging community members to help answer diverse and complex invasive species and natural resource questions. Thank you so much.
Next up, we'll have a lightning talk from Diana Pryson from the city of Minnetonka about floodplain forests and the changing climate. Okay. I think this is, yeah, the navigating to the app itself is what's going on. All right, there you go, Diana.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Diana Pryson. I'm a forestry technician with the city of Minnetonka. It's a suburban community, a second ring suburb of Minneapolis.
Hey, I need to interrupt for a sec. we're not seeing.
And I'm
Diana.
going to talk about a project that's very much in its beginning phases.
Shoot.
We are not advancing. Okay, that'll work. So Minnetonka has over 2,000 acres of what are called outlots. And these are parcels of land that were set aside for a variety of reasons, including stormwater retention, wetland preservation, open land and park space, some vacant properties and tax forfeit land. The project area I'll be talking about today is in our Opus Park Business District. This is in the southeast corner of the city. It's a very highly urbanized area. There's a lot of impervious surfaces, office buildings, apartment spaces. It's roughly 48 acres. And this is actually a pretty big parcel in terms of these outlots go. It consists mostly of wetland and then some floodplain forest as well. So I dug into the history of the area a little bit.
Pause, Dana, I'm sorry, I didn't get to that. We're not actually sharing the right screen.
Oh,
So I gotta,
yes.
yeah, will you pause and restart, Lane? I apologize. Wait a minute. I think because I had selected share the screen. Just share screen 2. Maybe this will solve the clicker issue as well. All right.
Those of you virtually didn't really miss out on much of the visual side, so I'll just keep going. So just taking a look at from a historical perspective, we know that this land was deeded to the city in 1977 and set aside for park and open land space from the Opus Park Corporation. It is a managed one wetland, most of it, that falls within the 9 Mile Creek Watershed District. It is part of their 100-year flood zone. And the DNR has also identified it as being potential habitat for the federally endangered species, the rusty patch bumblebee. What does it look like today? There is a formal paved trail system that runs through the forested area of this outlot that connects some bus stops on the northern section of it to the newly constructed Southwest light rail system. Looking at that forested area, it consists of probably what you would expect, a lot of cottonwood trees, box elder, ash, willow, and then lots and lots of buckthorn. So as is typical with these outlots is that they're very lightly managed. We don't actually invest any restoration dollars into them. We do manage for diseased and infested trees and any hazard trees that might pose a risk to private or public property. But then they're pretty much left kind of to their own devices. So there's a lot of buckthorn and garlic mustard and other invasives as well. So thinking about what can we do with this land for the future and kind of restore it to some of its former glory. We know that looking at some climate change predictability charts that it has a moderate ability, floodplain forests have a moderate ability to adapt to climate change. So a lot of the existing tree species are able to take wet and dry periods and can grow in different hardiness zones as well. We do need to inventory the space. So that's something that we haven't done yet. So getting in there and finding out exactly what trees are growing. And then removing any invasive species. So we want to go in and do a really big buckthorn bust so that we can start replanting. So some opportunities and challenges that we're running into. I think there's a lot of opportunities here. We can definitely increase the recreational value. So we want to draw people in to use the space recreationally, not just for transportation. And then diversify the forest type. So, getting rid of the buckthorn and adding some more interesting tree species. And then establishing an understory. So there really isn't much of an understory besides what we like to call old growth buckthorn, which is kind of all over in Minnetonka, but really giant buckthorn trees that hopefully will create some pollinator habitat. So attracting in that rusty pinch bumblebee and then increasing some habitat for other pollinators as well. And then we think we'll get some volunteer opportunities from this. We already did a kickoff planting here, working with the school group, planting some trees. And we'll hopefully have more of those opportunities as we get going with this project. And then also looking for more grant funding to support the implementation. Some of the challenges that we're seeing is public perception. So we had this Opus placemaking guide for the area that came out with some public input. And what we found is that people really want to see more formal park spaces in the area, as well as food forests. This is a wetland for the most part. a very naturalized space that wouldn't be appropriate for either of those things. So how can we get the public behind wanting to restore this area? We'll, likely to see some increased weather changes, so more waterlogging. How can we get new trees established when, it might get flooded out in a few years? And we'll probably see additional invasive species, so just continuing to monitor and manage those as well. And then I included deer on here because we have some really healthy suburban deer in Minnetonka, and it's so hard to get new trees going. We have to cage pretty much everything that we plant. And deer are predicted to get even, more robust as the climate warms. So how can we battle our deer population? And then limited resources. Our city doesn't invest any restoration dollars currently, but how can we convince city council and members of the public to want to invest resources into some of these projects? And that is it for me.
Thanks. As always, for our lightning talk presenters, make sure to add questions to the Slido, and posters are up across the hall. Next up, another City of Minnetonka employee, Josh Obermeyer. Josh happens to be our policy committee chair for the Minnesota chapter of SAF2. So if you have policy questions, ask Josh. And this is another lightning talk, right?
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, go for it, Josh.
All right. I'll be talking about slowing ash mortality in Minnetonka. As Dinah mentioned, it's a suburb of Minneapolis, about 12 miles west of Minneapolis. Josh Obermeyer, I'm a forestry technician at the city of Minnetonka. I do the field work on this sort of project, and then Hannibal Hayes, city forester, he's the one that oversees the project. So I'll first talk about what SLAM, or slow ash mortality, is. Then I'll talk about an emerald ash borer infestation site, how we apply the SLAM method, and then finally, how can this inform your work? So you can see the citation at the bottom. It was a published paper in 2012. It basically released 400 beetles into a site, and then they modeled the ash mortality over time, over the course of 10 years. And then they looked at different treatments, treating 10% of the trees, 20% of the trees, or no treatment at all, maybe just removing the trees. So if you're just removing infested trees from the population, you're not going to slow down mortality much. It's only about a year. Now, whereas if you're able to treat 20% of the ash trees in a given area 1 year after detection, you can slow that mortality down by 90 to 99% over the course of 10 years. That 1 year is kind of an unrealistic scenario. You're not likely to find emerald ash borer after 1 year of infestation. So this next one, so after treating 20% of the trees 4 years after detection, it's going to prevent 50 to 60% of mortality. And then they looked at 30, 40, 50%, had similar outcomes to 20%, and it got pretty expensive injecting several more trees. And I forgot to mention they're using amamectin benzoate chemical on the trees. And as far as 10%, the mortality rates weren't anywhere near as good as 20%. So the conclusion of the study, treating 20% of the trees was highly effective, economically feasible, and it reduced the cumulative costs by over half. Okay, so here's an infestation site in the northeast corner of the city. We discovered EAB in the fall of 2019. So last winter was our first time going to the neighborhoods, marking ash trees and requiring property owners to remove their trees. And we marked 254 ash over the course of the winter. And we wound up having a lot of residents who were unhappy, and it was a large financial burden. Some of the properties, they had 15, 16 trees that they needed to remove over a 60-day period. And when you're removing that many trees, you're getting into the $5,000 range. And it's difficult for some property owners to afford that. So we asked ourselves, how can we make the situation better for property owners? Let's try the SLAM method. So last winter, we surveyed all ash over 10 inches in diameter. We found 234 trees. And then we selected 61 of those trees, which is 26% for ash injection over the course of this summer. Then there are several property owners. You can see the red is our property. So there's a park, Westwood Park, and then several outlots. And then as far as private property goes, there are property owners injecting their trees. We don't know exactly how many. So that whole area, I don't think we'd get quite 20%, but I think it's going to be close. So basically the odds of a beetle while they're out over their 3 to 6 week period, feeding on ash and then laying their eggs, the odds of them hitting one of those 20% of the injected trees is pretty high, and that can knock the population back substantially. So how can this inform your work? You can slow down the exponential growth of EAB by up to 50%. This will give property owners more time to prepare, can spread the costs and work over a greater period of time. It just makes it a lot more manageable for property owners and ourselves. And then it's also removing dangerous and unsightly trees from the community. And looking forward, there's been heavy tree loss on our property, and we want to be a good example to our residents. So we removed all the buckthorn from the site over this winter, and then we're going to do an SAF sponsored volunteer planting event this coming fall and trying some interesting stuff. Hannibal is working with Ryan Murphy at the University of Minnesota. They're going to be trying some new Dutch elm disease resistant elms, and then trying some other interesting things like black gum or chinkapin oak. That's all I got for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Next up, we'll step away from the city of Minnetonka for a little bit, and we'll hear from Carrie Pike, who's joining us from probably Indiana.
That's right.
Is that right, Carrie?
Yeah.
Okay, we were still muted, so say that again.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, and right now we're seeing your presenter view.
Okay. So let me swap. How's that?
Good. All right, you're on.
All right. Thanks, everyone. It's nice to sort of be there. My name is Carrie Pike. I'm a regeneration specialist with the USDA Forest Service for the Eastern Region, State and Private Forestry. I am in West Lafayette, Indiana. I'm going to be talking to you about options for saving black ash through breeding. I'm going to be reporting on the work by two scientists with the Forest Service, Jennifer Cook and Kathleen Knight. They are with the Northern Research Station in Delaware, Ohio. My program is the RINGER program. It stands for Reforestation, Nursery, and Genetic Resources. Our website is ringer.net. So the problem that you're familiar with is emerald ash borer. As far as genetic resistance, black, white, and green ash are highly susceptible. Blue ash has some genetic resistance, and Manchurian ash, which is native to China, has a lot of genetic resistance. I put up these range maps of green ash on the left and black ash on the right, just to reiterate the size of the geographic range of these trees. We don't need a cultivar or two of resistant genotypes. We need populations that are improved, that are adapted to the range of conditions where these trees occur. And that is a big ask for us, for scientists to do. So my objectives is to share some promising research findings, some of Jennifer's work, describe some of the steps we can take to start saving black ash, encourage partners to set up plots to monitor for lingering trees, and I will describe a new participatory breeding program in Ohio. So breeding options, why should we bother breeding? Is resistance even attainable, and what is it? I will try to answer some of these questions. The one thing with breeding is people get it. People have dogs, they understand what breeding is, and so it's pretty easy to garnish public support for it. We rely on naturally occurring genetic variation. We find trees that have the potential for resistance, we mate them together with others, and we stack the genes for resistance. Here's the thing. I think about resistance as a ladder. The bottom of the ladder is 100% susceptible, top of the ladder is 100% resistant, black ash is at the bottom, Manchurian ash is at the top. Every generation that we can breed, we can climb another rung on that ladder to get elevated resistance. We are not going to get 100% immunity, We don't need it. So I think it's important to scale back the expectations for breeding programs. If you hear nothing or remember nothing, just remember this. Resistant trees at this stage are not going to look spectacular. They may simply live longer than trees that are susceptible, but we can improve resistance further if we can capture those trees that have managed to survive or linger and cross them with others through selective breeding. This is the concept. And this is, if you've been to tree improvement talks, I haven't used this cartoon before, but this kind of covers it. So if you find two lingering trees, they have different characteristics that they use for resistance. They've got different genes. If you cross them, the progeny segregate out into these different phenotypes. One of them you'll have a group of phenotypes that'll look worse than the parents. You'll get some that will look like the mom, some that will look like the dad, and then you'll get some that will be better than both of the parents, where all those genes will be stacked together. There's more additional selection. Those are the ones we want to identify, and each generation we do this, we can get more improvement. The concept, and this is basic tree improvement, is if you make enough of these crosses to develop a population, you can plant them into a second generation seed orchard. And in addition to having increased defenses against EAB, we also have good genetic diversity and an adaptive capacity to survive in the range of conditions where these species occur. So how susceptible is black ash compared to others? I'm going to pull a few figures from this paper that was published in 2020. Jennifer Cook is one of the co-authors on it. So unfortunately, it's very susceptible. So looking at this graph on the y-axis, it's least squared mean of proportion of larvae killed. So that means they challenged trees with larvae. Where the larvae die, you would say that's got resistance. If the larvae survive, they're susceptible. So 0 means highly susceptible, 1 is highly resistant. And I highlighted Manchurian ash in yellow, it's on the left, and I highlighted blue ash in the middle. And then of course, green, white, and black ash are at the bottom. So we know it's very susceptible. So if it's so susceptible, why bother breeding? Here's the thing. Black ash is a close relative of Manchurian ash. They can hybridize. We're not talking about a hybridization program here though. The phylogeny chart on the right is from that publication. But here's what's even more interesting. They have done a lot of work with Manchurian and with its genome. They have found 53 candidate genes. Those genes are for EAB resistance in Manchurian ash, and they are also found in black ash. And in this phylogeny, you can see I highlighted the couplet underneath here, the green one. Manchurian ash and Niagara are right next to each other. They share a great deal of their genome. So there may be opportunities to use genomics to make selection in the future. Okay. So how do we select these lingering black ash trees in this mess in the wake of EAB? So we have a good handle on how to do this with green and white ash in Ohio. In Ohio, they find 95% mortality on green ash occurs 4 to 7 years after your first EAB positive trap catch. Those lingering trees need to be big enough to have been infested during the peak EAB. So you want them at least 4 inches in diameter, but ideally bigger is better. You want them to have a healthy canopy. So the image on the right, obviously the dead tree was susceptible, but there's one right next to it that's alive. That is a lingering one. So after the tree should still be alive, it might be ugly, but it should still be alive after the mortality rate has leveled off. Usually you get after 4 years, about 50% mortality. After 2 years, you get 95% mortality. All of this is documented in this GTR, which is freely available. Kathleen is the lead author. It's how you set up monitoring plots. So that covers on the right images. There's a lot of images and like how you set up the plots and how to describe the crown dieback, which is what I've shown. Here's the other rub though with black ash. We know it takes fewer EAB to kill black ash. So the picture on the left is a dead black ash. You can just see there's not a lot of galleries. The picture on the right is green ash. This is provided by Nate Seagard, who is with State and Private Forestry in our Durham, New Hampshire field office. So last week, I had conversations with Jennifer and Kathleen and Nate. How does selection for lingering black ash differ? First of all, I know in Minnesota from my years out there that there's been a lot of black ash decline. So you want to set up plots and note anything that is, already kind of declining from other causes. We think right now you should start looking for lingering trees 3 to 4 years after you've observed EAB induced decline, and probably 5 to 6 years after the first positive trap catch. So a little bit sooner than the recommendations for green ash. The lingering trees should be about 4 inches in diameter minimum. Bigger is better, but they may have a hard time finding them. You want to include vigorous trees in a plot. And again, they're recommending, you can see that pictures from the Nightingale paper, but just 10th acre plots. You want to include vigorous trees because those are going to probably just have more of their defenses expressed. When we find these trees, it'd be great to get seed, but we're probably going to have to get scion to graft them. Grafting is an important part of this. So this is from Nate. He gave me this slide last week from black ash mortalities of 2021. This might be in Michigan. I don't remember where he said this exact data is from, but all diameter classes were heavily impacted. Only the smallest diameter classes, 1 to 5 inches, remain alive. 80% have been killed. Only a single 2.5 inch diameter black ash had a healthy canopy condition in 2021. So they're not doing well. This is in Michigan. They first observed EAB in 2003. They detected it with girdled trap trees in 2004. And 7 years later, they had over 90% mortality. They also noticed these are mixed black and green ash stands. They noticed the black ash went out first. And this is recently published in Forest Ecology and Management. So assuming we can get our hands on these trees, how do you do the resistance? So Jennifer Cook's lab is doing this. I realize this is really labor intensive and wonky, and I don't expect anybody to just pick this up. We need to refine this. They get eggs on coffee filter. They take them to the stem. They use 3 grafted replicates of each lingering ash tree. Again, grafting is sort of critical to this. After 8 weeks, they dissect them. They look at the larvae. Their metrics are whether the egg hatched, what is the larval outcome, first instar, second, third, or fourth. They look at the larval weight. I realize that by dissecting them, they're essentially killing the tree, but they're green ash, so they sprout right back, so you can conserve the genotype. Some data. Again, it's the same y-axis from that other graph. You can see the grafted green ash selections, very, very susceptible. They did a couple of black ash that were lingering. They actually did quite well, and you can see the Manchurian ash is the green bar on the far right. In addition, Jennifer was able to get some open pollinated seedlots of black ash. Now, there was a very large effort to collect open pollinated seed a few years ago, not from lingering trees, and they are in storage at Fort Collins in Ames, Iowa. Jennifer was able to get some seed lots and just did a preliminary screening to see how this might look with open pollinated material. So on this graph, I highlighted the blue ones, that's 22015, that's just the accession. These are not graphs, these are half sibs. So all the blue bars are half sibs. These are not means, this is their rating. So there's no error bars on them. So you can see though, that compared to the best lingering green ash selection within that family, there were 2 individuals that were as good, if not better, than their best lingering ash. And these are not lingering trees. 22015 is a random selection. I also highlighted a selection that came from upstate New York from the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. They also similarly, a lot of them died, but there were a number of them at the top of the scale that were better than some, as good as their best lingering green ash selection. So even though it's highly susceptible as a species, I think there's enough variation within the species that we might be able to make some headway. So I did want to make you aware of this new program. This is called the Great Lakes Basin Forest Health Collaborative. It's with Holden Forests and Gardens, which is an arboretum outside of Cleveland, Ohio. It is funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Rachel Kapler is the coordinator. There's their, if you just Google Great Lakes Basin Forest Health Collaborative, you can find them. Their focal species right now is ash, hemlock, and American beech. Rachel's job is to train partners how to collect seed, how to set up monitoring plots, how to graft. She's helping them in all these different phases of the tech transfer work related to this tax and the research. And basically what happened is Jennifer Cook and Kathleen were getting really tired of getting calls because they couldn't handle all the calls of people who wanted to participate. So we were able to get this program started. We hope to get another program like this. This program is limited to the Great Lakes Basin, which is a little tiny part of Minnesota. We would like to expand this to the Lake States. We're working on that. But this is available. Rachel's happy to chat and do some online trainings if you need it. This is my last slide. I wanted to finish with a picture of, this comes from the Seed Lab. These are the Fraxon and Niagara collections at GRIN, the Germplasm Resources Information Network. Note that these are not lingering trees, and someday it would be really nice to have seed and scion from lingering trees to help us conserve ash resistance in the future. And I want to thank colleagues Charlie Flower, who's giving a talk a little bit later, Rachel Kapler and David Burke with Holden Forests and Gardens, Les Benedict, who's the St. Regis Mohawk Tribes Forest Resource Program in New York, and our friends at the Seed Lab. Bob Carfelt retired, but he was responsible for really leading that effort. Becky Vick, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and Nate for providing slides last week for this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us, Carrie, from a far distance. Thanks.
You betcha.
So we'll head back to the city of Minnetonka. And this is Aaron Sturmer, who works for the city. Yeah, this one. Great. And with the mask on, really make sure to project.
Everyone, my name is Erin Sturmer. I am a tree inspector with the city of Minnetonka, and I had the opportunity to survey and work on a management plan for a unique park in the city called Hilloway. It contains 15 acres of all 3 of our native pine species, 1 for each of the pines. So today I will be focusing on the harvesting and milling process that took place in the red pine stand and why small-scale forestry operations are important in an urban setting. So just the visual, the red pine stand is just over 2 acres in size. There are about 311 trees per acre with an average height of 66 feet and an average diameter of 11 inches. The trees are planted in rows in the 1950s. So today there's a lot of overcrowding going on. We have a lot of damage due to wind throw to the canopy. And also we were seeing a lot of co-dominant stems starting between like 5 and 20 feet from the base. So originally to me, this sounded like a perfect candidate for a clear cut, but since this is a heavily recreated city park, we had to come up with unique ways to remove damaged trees to promote the health and longevity of our residuals. So it was decided that to reach this goal, we would do thinnings in stages just due to wind throw possibilities and visual sensitivity. So the thinning, we decided to do a thinning from below and start with 5% of the trees per acre, which came up to about 33 trees total per thinning. So we marked poorly formed or damaged trees to start off with. So for harvesting, we decided to go with the contractor called Holistic Tree and Forestry. These are climbing arborists, and they were chosen because we needed to reduce the impact to our residuals. And this is just, again, because high recreation in this park. So each tree was either spiked up and rigged down in 8-foot logs as seen in the photo on the left, or if there was room, we felled the trees whole and bucked on the ground. So all of the logs were then hand hauled to the site, to the edge of the site for milling. We harvested about 4 to 5 cords came out, and this whole process took about 3 days. So a fun objective of this project was that all of the trees that were harvested were going to be milled on site. The city owns a Lucas sawmill, which can be seen in the photo on the right. And the contractor Holistic Tree and Forestry brought in a bandsaw that can be seen in the photo on the left. So the purpose of having both of those on site was to try to get the milling moving so that we could get through as much as we could in that time frame. And the lumber is going to be used for park benches, city trail signs, or interpretive signs that we can put right back into the city parks. So the overarching goal of the city owning a sawmill is so that we can implement wood utilization into our forest management plans, so that if we are going to be removing trees, we can actually use them for something more than lumber or chips. I'm sorry, firewood or chips, not lumber. So here's just a photo on the left of the lumber that was being milled from the bandsaw, and on the right is back at our public works where the lumber is stacked dry. So why is this important? First off, in an urban setting, climbing arborists are a lot more accessible, and they help us accomplish small, unique, and even difficult thinnings within our parks. This opens up the opportunity for us to get creative with our management tactics and with our thinnings. And we can just remove trees with virtually no impact to our residual trees. Second, surveying small stands gives us a deeper understanding of what we do have in our parks and our wooded outlets. As you all know, knowing like basal area and volume and trees per acre will help us make more informed management decisions and just better decisions for the stand as a whole. So also, since the city owns a sawmill, knowing these volumes is huge, just so we know what we're taking out of the stands and how much milling hours we're going to need to do that, and also what we can actually use the lumber for when we're done. And lastly, this is a huge positive educational opportunity for the public, just to see the planning, the felling, and the milling process all right in front of them in one place. They can physically see the advantages of harvesting trees, not only for like the health of the stand, but also for wood utilization. Thank you.
A number of us probably have heavily overstocked red pine stands similar to what you have. If any of you have been out on our ski trails, you see that we have those too here at the Forestry Center. Or if you've driven on Highway 35, I-35, you see them in the middle. So Jennifer Corcoran ended up presenting yesterday, so we'll jump to my lightning talk. My poster is across the hall, and I'll be over there a little bit during lunch. And we might have the same screen sharing issue, Paul. So are we seeing what we need to see?
Looks
All right,
good.
so thanks, Eli. Yeah, so this is a little case study that I did here. I called it Using Diversity to Build Ecological and Economic Resilience. And I'm calling it a FDN 33 mixed wood. It's a little case study on a 10-acre site here at the Cloquet Forestry Center. The silvicultural objectives for this project were to build the ecological and economic resilience of this stand. When it comes to resilience for climate change and ecological change and economic change, we're trying to look for all these different ways to build the bounce back ability basically of our forests. And sometimes for us as forest managers, that means we're doing it across an entire land base. And sometimes that means we're doing it at the stand scale. This is an example of stand scale resilience improvement. And so the ways to build those resilience that I didn't come up with, but I'm trying to implement, is to basically improve the compositional and structural diversity. And I say improve, and when I actually look at the pre-sale data, I'm actually basically just maintaining the tree level diversity that was already there. And so sometimes I have to catch myself and saying, okay, actually I'm maintaining diversity that's already there rather than necessarily improving it. So slight language change, but important to recognize that the forest that I was already working with had some diversity built into it, which then suggests it's a good site to continue working with the diversity that's there. So the tools and the techniques that I use, like I said, I did not come up with. This case study is mostly an example of how to use the tools that are already out there. Marcella and Austi presented yesterday on their use of the climate change field guide for northern Minnesota, and it's used for the floodplain forest. So I did basically the same thing. I used that climate change field guide put together by NIAX, but for the fire dependent forest. So my plant community was a fire dependent North 33, which is a northern dry mesic mixed woodland. The other technique that the other tool that I used was the Minnesota DNR tree suitability table. So what the tree suitability table is, lists all the tree species that are expected to be in a given native plant community. And it's not big enough on the screen here because it's doesn't need to be. It's just giving the example of all I did is I looked at the column for the FDN 33 and said, I need to choose a couple of these and make sure that they're in my prescription, basically, or my planting plan. So those are tools that are already out there that I used. The silviculture tool that I used was a clear cut with reserves. So a majority of what I reserved was the white spruce that were on site. So I wanted to build a little bit of a seed bank for white spruce. But then I used a clear cut to create this light conditions that I knew the next generation of trees would need. And I use a combination of natural and planted regeneration to get this second cohort among the reserve trees. Bug capping was necessary for making sure that the white pine didn't eat all of my pine regen. And then we recently used a brush saw release to make sure that those shade intolerant species had enough sun. The natural regeneration techniques that we used were resprouting, the stem root resprouts for aspen, and it ended up being very vigorous. So that's why that brush saw treatment was needed. Which is not a surprise to a lot of you who have worked in the stand. If you cut down one aspen, you get roughly 10,000 back, hopefully. And if you don't, so one of my lessons learned, I'll go to the bottom first, is that robust aspen regen is both a benefit and a challenge. So it's a benefit to making sure that a harvested site gets brought back to a young forest condition, but it's also a challenge in particular when you're thinking of diversity, because it's so aggressive. So I tried to build on the technique, the aspen spruce mixed wood technique that Blandon has been doing a lot of the last few years, and basically develop my plan to mimic what they were doing, but then recognize that because I was working with more shade intolerant species, so I planted white pine, red pine, northern red oak, and white spruce. I recognized that they needed a bit more sun than the 4-foot radius usually recommended by Blandon for the aspen spruce mixed wood. So we ended up doing a 6-foot or larger. I kind of went nuts with the brush saw and just said, let's mow this aspen down. It will be fine. We're not at risk of losing it. And I need to, because my priority was diversity, I wanted to make sure that I was giving space to those things that needed light. And another lesson learned for me is that those tools exist already. I didn't have to come up with anything novel. It was the only novelty of this is saying, okay, here, I want to actually put this into practice. And because there wasn't a specific long-term plan for doing a multi-species mixed wood like this, I actually planted at 3 different densities. And that was that's another level of structural diversity that I wanted to build into the site in order to make sure that at least some of those trees were going to respond positively to this treatment. And you can learn more about it in that Z-link and by coming over to my poster or asking me. So thanks much. We will get the other speakers down here. And we've got about 10 minutes. As they're coming down, I'm going to encourage, we didn't build in a student professional mixer to the plan this year, and that was kind of an oversight in our planning committee. So at lunch, if you are a career forester or a career scientist, please try and reach out and say hello to a student or somebody that you think might be a student here. If you're a student, over lunch, maybe think about inviting a professional in, because they might be a little bit intimidated by your students or something, just like we were when we were students, a little bit intimidated by the professionals. So I would encourage everybody to just reach out to each other and sit with a slightly different crowd than maybe you have been already. So Eli, you're going to share a screen. And the first question is for Angie. Why are people upset about jumping worms?
Right.
What problems are they creating for land managers?
Yeah, so I dropped in a link in there to our extension website, but the short answer is all worms are ecosystem engineers. So they change the ecosystem in many ways, starting with soil and then the herbaceous layer, and then the critters that live in that layer, and the critters that eat those critters, and up the chain. Jumping worms are even more problematic. So if you were to survey like a 1 square foot for worms, and in our normal suite of non-native worms, we have no native earthworms in the state of Minnesota, would inhabit a space from about 0 to 6 feet. And there might be 20 worms in that space of up to 16 different species. When jumping worms move into a site for reasons we don't exactly know, all other worms appear to disappear. We suspect a virus or disease. And the density of worms in that same square foot may double or even triple. So you have a lot more worms, but instead of living in 0 to 6 feet, they live entirely in the top few inches, probably 5 or less. So you have 2 to 3 times the volume of worms in this little tiny top of the soil, which is where you and me and a lot of plants try to live. And so they are very active and they wiggle a lot, so they're very noticeable. But what gardeners are experiencing and forests to some degree is changes in soil. So it looks a lot more like coffee grounds in texture. It erodes more easily. They do eat plant roots when they get hungry enough. They also eat, they really like wood mulch and they can survive in wood mulch. So think of the bagged mulch at your box store. They can survive in that. That's a point of introduction. They can survive in soil. They can survive in roots. And they can be spread through leaf raking in the fall. Their cocoons can live, again, their entire life cycle is in the top few inches of soil. So people are finding them introduced in that way. So in summary, they drastically can change the appearance of your garden and of the forest, and they can be introduced and it feels like everything you want to do on your property. And as I said in the presentation, there are no scientifically recommended ways in which to manage them. So once you have them, I say sorry.
All right, thanks. And Eli put the link in the chat so that people have access to that. So Erin, how was your project received by members of the public?
So first, people were a little bit alarmed when they were seeing that we were marking trees for removal. I think people thought we were going to cut down a lot more than we actually did. But they became super positive when they saw the milling going on. People were like, oh, that's really cool. Like, what are you going to do with all the wood? And as we explained, we were going to put it back in the parks. People were very positive about all of that.
Okay, great. Did you do some preemptive community engagement, or was it just ended up going out there and marking and trying to talk to people that went by as you're marking?
We put signs up a week before, but when I was doing the surveying, I was out there kind of sporadically throughout a couple of weeks, and I talked to a lot of people. I had a lot of people approach me, asking me what I was doing, and I just tried to word of mouth, be like, we're doing this to just cut down a few, kind of figure out for the health of the forest what we can do to
All right, great.
bring down population.
So Angie, another one for you. If we're removing emerald cork that were used to replace ash, what viable native species do we have to replace them?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I did not answer anything because there are a couple of lists that our extension website that I frankly do not love. And so extension is working on a new plant database. So lots of natives will be in there, plus some horticultural varieties that seem appropriate. And so we're working on that. So that is really ultimately where I want people to go. And that will not only include plants for your urban landscape, so boulevard trees like emerald cork tree, but also for people in yards and gardens. But it will also include plants for native forest restoration work. So what are plants that would work for various sites? And so fingers crossed that'll be done in a year.
Okay, great. Next one's for you, Diana. Has the city of Minnetonka considered a managed archery hunt to reduce deer numbers? I know this has been a useful technique or useful management tool in many towns and large cities in the upper Midwest, and it could aid in tree regeneration.
Not exactly. We do some tree or deer management within the city. It's actually put together by our police department. So they do some managed hunts and culling. And those numbers, whatever they're harvesting, is based on vehicle impact. So it actually has nothing to do with natural resources, unfortunately. But we did put together a natural resources master plan, and deer is kind of at the top of the list because we're definitely battling it really hard. But yeah, I could see a managed deer hunt being something that we would be interested in.
Another one for you, Diana. Just disappeared. So we'll go to Josh. How much does it cost for Minnetonka to implement SLAM and treat the ash trees? Where does the funding come from?
So $3.50 roughly on our end. Yeah, so it's about $3.50 per inch diameter. So those 61 trees, can't do the math right now, but it's pretty inexpensive really. For some of it, it's going to be coming out of our city budget. And then we also just got a grant from Hennepin County to do a lot of this work surrounded around ash. And then from a resident's perspective in Minnetonka, costs about $5.85 per inch diameter. So if you have a 20-inch tree, you're talking about $120 every 2 years versus $1,000 removal. So you can preserve your tree, maintain the canopy, and it's definitely not realistic to treat every tree, but if you have 20 of them on your property, it might be nice to save 3 to 5 trees, maybe a little more.
Okay, and is that that's including the labor costs, or is that just the?
That's everything, chemical, labor.
All right, cool.
Yep.
Aaron, is Minnetonka unique among Minnesota cities in terms of having its own mill to utilize timber resources? And do other cities like St. Paul, Minneapolis have this? If not, what barriers might exist?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Hannibal, but I don't believe so. Not that I have heard of, that any other cities are doing this at the moment. I believe barriers are labor and just, I believe that's part of it. I think that the cost of it, buying a mill and having the actual, like, all of the amount of wood that they need to actually keep that going is probably a big barrier for most cities. I think that it's also just out of focus because of all the disease and pest trees that we're focusing on right now, even though that should be integrated into it, but I think it's more removals and dealing with the pests so far.
There are a variety of urban mills popping up though, right? So
Wood in the hood
maybe
is the one.
Minnetonka is unique in the sense that you all are purchasing and using your own, but does Minnetonka have any trees that end up going to some of the urban mills already? Like wood from the hood is the one that I think of, but I think there are others as well.
Yeah, I don't believe so.
So that's mostly coming from Minneapolis, probably.
Yeah.
Okay,
Can I jump in real quick?
sure.
So in Rochester, I'm on the park board and I'm also occasionally connected with the city forester. And I will say they have rented a mill and had it brought into the Parks and Rec department. And so the Parks and Rec in Rochester has been saving the good trees. So these are generally high quality, large diameter logs. And they just pile them up until they get a good pile. And then they rent a mill and an operator, and he comes in and he saws them. And then they've been using that for park benches and structures. They've been putting ash wood structures around like porta pots and dumpsters and whatnot in cities. And so just a lot of like ways in which to use those things.
Yeah. Next one, Eli. Aaron, Angie, how will Amber cork tree sale requirements be enforced?
Yeah, so I did reply on the thing. So it would go under the Minnesota Noxious Weed Law, which is enforced by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, like all the other species on that list. And I'll tell you right now, they are most active in enforcement for the eradicate list species. This would not go on the eradicate list. For the rest, they don't, it's not like somebody shows up with a gun and says remove it, right? That is not how that works. So it would just be up to the municipality to remove it if it were a problem. And frankly, for private woodland owners or private homeowners, they probably wouldn't enforce it. I mean, if you look, buckthorn is on that list, right? So clearly they're not getting rid of every buckthorn in Salem.
So Aaron, next one's for you again, Aaron. Are you concerned that thinning the pines will release the buckthorn? And I'm going to change it. To what extent are you concerned? Because I like to keep things out of a good or bad, yes or no binary.
Yeah, a little bit, but underneath the red pine stands specifically, I'd be more concerned about some of the other parts of the park in the pine stands, but in the red pine specifically, they've done like extensive restoration. So there was a lot of elderberry and some ash in there, just not a whole lot of buckthorn under the red pine specifically. So in this case, not so much.
Okay, cool. Carrie, let's go to you. Is there enough variability and resistance within green ash and black ash families that we could hope that the species would survive on their own instead of screening, selecting, and doing the second generation orchards?
I don't think so. The resistance is very weak because these trees have such high genetic diversity. The genes are scattered all around. I have a feeling, there may be occasional individuals, 20 or 30 years down the road, but I honestly think that if we don't do anything, we're going to lose them.
Or transition to like the is it the chestnut, which it persists in out in the woods out east, but basically as 1-inch saplings and then they die.
Possibly something like that. Yeah.
Another one for you, Carrie. Will ash's ability to sprout mean that these genotypes can remain on the landscape?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure. Somebody who's more familiar with the species. I'm a conifer kid. Somebody who's more familiar with the species might have a better idea. We've had enough dead and dying ash trees that there's probably somebody in your audience who can answer that better than me.
Anybody want to try and answer?
Yeah, I'll try to speak loudly, and it's been a few years since I've read this paper, but Sam Ward, who is at the University of Minnesota, he's moved on to another state now as a prof, but he actually did some research looking at the longer term effects of EAB on ash forests and found that, right, sprouting can help maintain some level of ash in the landscape, but then those trees are ultimately infested by EAB. So they can buy us more time, maybe for additional seed collections, but again, it only takes us so far.
Could you hear that, Carrie and Eli?
I could, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. That was Rachel Doobie.
Thank
It
you.
seems like this maybe is a general question to the group, or is it directed at anybody in particular?
Sort of directed at Angie, but I'm.
Angie, yeah. So what can we do to assess invasiveness of woody species before they start becoming widely available in nurseries? I'm
Yeah.
amazed at how much calorie pear and Japanese lilac continues to be planted on city streets.
Yeah, I hear you. So I dropped in as a response a link to the Minnesota Advisory, Noxious Weed Advisory Committee, and they assess species for policy. There is almost nothing to prevent the introduction of plants into sale. And so, I mean, horticulture is a powerful industry. You have interstate commerce rules that drop in really quickly. I mean, so the federal government can limit some plants and does, but it is very few. And so, I mean, there are potential tools that could be used in policy. I think they will not be, right? And so I just really think that we need to change the way consumers and industry think about these things and help them to see other species as possible and probable. And that is like a culture shift and change. So it is not an easy.
So we need to start lobbying big horticulture to not provide those things.
And I'll tell you, so I said the Red Mulberry group. So there are people in that group, including our new horticulture professor at the university, who's trying to reintroduce native hickories into the urban landscape. They've been really neglected in that space. And so he was the one who was able to get the group together to talk about red mulberry introductions. And I cannot express to you the sense of relief that group had. Like, people care about red mulberries, and we are all together in the same Zoom space. I mean, there was such enthusiasm. And that group is much better positioned than I to understand the workings of horticulture. Like, that is not the space in which I live, but they do. And so if we can start clicking those levers, and to give horticulture a little credit, I mean, they don't like to be painted as the bad guy. They are very committed to trees and diversity, and they're aware of some of these issues. So we need to not paint it as us versus them, but we do need to sort of help. We also, I do think, need to create some demand within their customer base, right? So if more people go out and say, I want natives, then they're more likely to sell them. And we see that with all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, all right, thanks. One last question, and then we'll break for lunch. Angie, do you know if the female fruits on Amur cork tree originally labeled as males are actually producing viable seed?
I do not. So I did answer there. So I didn't check. We didn't test for seed viability. We only tested for presence. I will say that there was data. So once volunteers started looking for Amur cork tree, they were doing a specific assignment going to these specific trees. But then we got quite a number, I forget how many, like 12 or 14 reports of naturalized Amur cork tree in unmanaged natural areas, right? So then we actually had better data to support the fact that indeed they were becoming invasive. Now that, could those have only been from female trees? Maybe, we don't really know. But I would say the best research around this switching gender is out of ginkgos. And I'll just tell you, there are a lot of seed-bearing ginkgos in Rochester, which I'm almost 100% for certain were all produced as males. And so I think it would be maybe a bit naive to assume that they are not going to be viable, but I did not test it.
Okay, thanks. So we've got about an hour here for lunch. And again, I encourage if you're a professional, try and connect with a student. And if you're a student, try and connect with a professional over lunch and the break between. So we'll meet back just before 1 to get our second to last block going. Thanks.